Okay, let's get started. So thank you everyone for joining today's webinar, 5 Key Takeaways from the Voices of RegTech. My name is Amanda Brief. I'm the Marketing Director here at ClauseMatch, and I'm going to be your moderator for today. And of course, before we get started, we always have those housekeeping items. So please note all participants except the panelists are muted. If you have any questions throughout the webinar, feel free to put them in the Q&A box. And if you experience any audio issues or have any other comments, you can provide your feedback in the comments box. And then lastly, we always get this question, when will I see the recording? So we'll send out an email with the follow-up to the recording as well as the presentation tomorrow afternoon. So look forward to that. Now, before we get started, I want to introduce today's panelists. We have a great group of experts in the RegTech space. So I'm going to give each of the speakers an opportunity to introduce themselves. And we also have an icebreaker question as well, which is, what is something you look forward to doing after the pandemic is over? So if each of you can do the quick intro and then answer that kind of fun icebreaker question, that would be great. So first, we'll start with Evgeny, if you want to do a quick intro.
Hi, everyone. I'm Evgeny. I'm CEO and founder of ClauseMatch. Founded ClauseMatch 8 years ago to help financial institutions and regulated companies to operate safely and to bring compliant products to the market. And my previous background, I was in legal and compliance and tech at Morgan Stanley, and before that in oil and gas. Yeah, in terms of what I'm looking forward to doing when the pandemic is over, I think everyone would answer pretty much the same, but obviously looking to travel overseas, somewhere warmer than the UK where I'm based. And yeah, just generally seeing more people, meeting people outside of immediate circle that we were able to meet in the last 18 months.
Thank you. Nirvana, do you want to go next?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Nirvana Farhadi. I have a background of 20 plus years in financial services, always with a compliance, risk, audit, operations hat on. I've worked on various sectors across financial services, products and instruments. I started in around 2012, I think it was, in the RegTech space, along with some industry peers, starting to pioneer that for financial services. It's been around in other industries, but really taking that on to kind of help automate that process, given the regulatory requirements that kept coming out like a tsunami. So I have worked with industry stakeholders across the board, including global regulators. I have been at various organizations such as KPMG, where I was the head of regulatory reporting there. My last official role was at Hitachi Vantara. I was the head of Ragtech, and I owned that business for them there. And currently I sit on various advisory boards for startups in the space across financial services, healthcare, real estate, telco, and my most recent appointment is with Grant Thornton UK LLP on the advisory board. In terms of what I'd like to do after, as it was mentioned, it's nice to go and see the family. That's definitely something I'm looking forward to. I'm currently based in the US, so I haven't been back home to the UK for quite a while now. So just the simple things in life that we took for granted, just simple traveling, I think. So thank you.
Thank you. All right, next, Robert.
Thanks very much. So I'm Robert Bohr. I'm the founder and CEO of Keepable. And our start with the why from Simon Sinek is to joyfully use tech to resolve people's headaches and make them feel happier. And our first product doing that is around GDPR. So we make that super simple, intuitive, and we really focus on the insights to help people know where they are, where they're going, and give great answers so they can capture all the business that's coming as the economies start exploding now. So after lockdown finishes, whenever that finishes, what I'm most looking forward to is, again, family, as has been mentioned, and going to see maybe more vulnerable family members, and without having to do all the different tests and stuff.
Yeah, makes sense. Sarah?
Hi everybody, so thank you for this opportunity. I'm excited about the conversation today. So I'm CEO and co-founder of ChangeGap, which is combining consulting and Ragtech. So for about 25 years, I was contracting consulting in different financial services firms right across the spectrum, banking, building societies, insurers, and asset managers. With regulatory reporting and change implementation as one of the key common themes. So eventually I thought it's about time, we productize this. And so 18 months ago, we set up ChangeGap and, as well as helping address regulatory reporting issues. We feel very much it's the ecosystem approach, and it's an ecosystem of people as well as products. So in terms of Ragtech adoption, helping address that gap. So in terms of what I want to do after the pandemic, I'm not sure if it will ever be over, but to a point where we feel it is. So I specifically would like to go to either Singapore, Korea, Japan, Vancouver, and New York, maybe one or more of those.
Great, those are on my list as well. And lastly, Vasil, I want to give a quick introduction.
Hi, good morning and good afternoon to all. My name is Vasily Foka. I'm founder and managing partner of Thales Capital. This is a venture firm out of London. The company's been over 12 years old, and we've been investing sort of in seed stage and Series A as the first ticket. I have a portfolio of over 50 companies. Ragtech and sort of legal tech was always one of the acquirers of our interest. We have a few portfolio companies in that space, from FieldQuest that was sold to Avalara, to Untitled, to CloseMatch, to Luminance, and a few others. So we super excited about compliance in Ragtech. The main reason is just we believe is this technology that is driving and the data is being created. We believe every company fundamentally will be connected, and it's not just the financial services and insurance services. So from that perspective, we think that the regulation and compliance will be needed almost for every business that wants to trade and be connected. I think that's why we see a phenomenal growth opportunity in that space. I'm happy to share some ideas during this webinar. Regarding what to do post-COVID, I agree with Sarah. I don't think there will be post-COVID. We will be always in COVID. It's just the question how easily we can be traveling, and I think we're already adapting to that, both travel-wise, business-wise.
Mm-hmm.
But I agree. I think probably more travel than everybody's aspiring for.
Yep, exactly. Great. Well, thank you everyone for your introductions. We're going to go ahead and get started with the webinar. So before we begin, I just wanted to say that this webinar is a result of the recent Voice of RegTech report that we put out a few months ago. So that survey was basically to measure and get a better understanding of how the pandemic has impacted RegTech firms. So some of the things that we came away from this study was around, how the pandemic has affected industry sales, and particularly financial institutions' attitudes towards technology. We also wanted to see, what challenges RegTech firms had regarding the pandemic. And then lastly, see what RegTech firms' view on the role of regulators are. So between that, we kind of combined it into 5 key findings that we're going to talk through during today's webinar. So the first finding is a result of, there's an increase in demand for innovative solutions. So there's no surprise here. Changes to working practices throughout COVID have increased demand for RegTech solutions that can, enhance oversight, improve collaboration, and boost overall efficiency. And this is reflected in the sales trends across the industry. So for example, from our study, we saw that 42% said they experienced a high uptick in sales over the last 6 months. Meanwhile, 50% of firms said that they saw a moderate increase in sales over the last 6 months. What's also interesting to note is that 50% of survey respondents said the sales cycle has somewhat shortened recently, while 8% reported that the sales cycle has significantly shortened over the last year. And lastly, when it comes to where is this new business coming from, the majority, 50% of new business is reportedly coming from banks, followed by financial institutions. So with that, panelists, I'd love to hear your thoughts on these key findings. For the first one, I'm going to direct this question at you, Robert. So when it comes to the pandemic, how has the ongoing crisis influenced RegTech?
For sure. Thank you very much. So I think your survey is excellent. I do. Thank you very much for making that public, and that report is a fantastic milestone. I mean, the FCA said originally RegTech was new technologies developed to help overcome regulatory challenges in financial services. So obviously things like KYC, AML are things that people go to straight off. But as we discussed before going on to make the live session, regulatory challenges encompass everything from GDPR as well through to everything else, which is the area that we're in. And as Vasily said, almost every business is going to be affected by various different regulatory challenges, and indeed GDPR affects every business. So I think what happened with the pandemic was to overcome those regulatory challenges, suddenly people were, well, how do we work from home? So you could almost in that point put Zoom into a RegTech at that point, because it was helping banks overcome regulatory challenges of trading. So I think it's broadened the definition of RegTech and the awareness of RegTech. It's also led to a massive increase, as we'll talk about later, in online cloud adoption. And it's made people just look for ways to achieve what they had when they had 100 people in a room to having 100 people online instead and working from home. So in my mind, that's really the major impact has been that ability for to bring banks to the table, to bring the rest of financial services to the table. And we're seeing other businesses as well. And I echo the sales cycle shortening point as well.
Yeah, makes sense. And then when it comes to, we said before that most of this RegTech business is coming from banks. Nirvana, I want to ask you this. Why do you think this is the case?
Well, with the onset of the pandemic, what we saw was, businesses shutting down, people getting laid off, and, almost the whole economy coming to a grinding halt. And what happened was that businesses like banks suddenly discovered that, well, we can't go into our offices or the brick and mortar buildings. So their operations had to be extended outside of their brick and mortar offices into people's home environments. So from then, it was necessary to have some RegTech solutions or look to RegTech to start putting parameters in place so that they can conduct their business and continue as normally as possible. So that's kind of what we saw happening. And, prior to the pandemic, there was a lot of areas of research and investment going into R&D and RegTech type solutions. But when we hit the pandemic and the devastation of that, it was an absolute necessity for firms to start ramping up. And really, within a period of a couple of months, we did about 10 years worth of digital transformation, I think, during the pandemic. So it was pretty hard going. And, for someone like me who's been flying the flag for RegTech for such a long time, it was actually as negative as the pandemic and devastating the outcome has been, it was a positive thing for the RegTech industry, because now people are no longer asking, what's the market opportunity in RegTech? They're actually saying, well, where can we get our hands on the relevant RegTech solutions so that we can continue our operations? So that's the answer in terms of the banks. And that's affected actually all sectors and businesses, not just banks. Any industry that's hit with any type of regulation requires some kind of RegTech solution to keep abreast and keep automation going and help them through this crisis.
Yeah, and this kind of leads into our next question just around the sales cycle. So Jay, I want to ask you, why do you think the sales cycle has shortened for RegTech solutions?
Well, I think the sales cycle shortened because suddenly projects which were on the back burner became very important in institutions. Purely the adoption of Zoom and Microsoft Teams and other collaboration tools suddenly went from project number 100 to project number 1. And we've heard that from many banks. We've been speaking to even Zoom guys, and they were like, we're having so much business just coming through. We need to implement next week. And that was, the first 2 months of the pandemic. But the sales cycle really shortened because I believe there was a change in how regulators were doing supervision, because previously they were able to be in the building in those large banks, and they were able to audit them, in the building, on place, sitting next to a person and understanding what the person does. Suddenly they're asking these questions remotely, and then the management is trying to come up with the answers, and they don't have the answers. So they had to email to everyone within their teams asking, well, can you send me this document? Can you send me that document? How do you do this? Have you done that? Suddenly they realized we need more transparency into how we work. And I think that put a lot more pressure on implementing some solutions, which just brings transparency into what people do, how they do it, and some reporting, some understanding of what are we actually doing around certain compliance. And I think regulators also started realizing that, we actually need banks to use systems to provide that type of data. And it's not just transaction reporting, it's not just AML KYC, but actually, actual conduct. We need to look into conduct and how is conduct communicated, how is conduct not enforced, but followed within those organizations.
Yeah, exactly. And lastly, I want to address this question. So probably either you, Sarah, or you, Robert, in terms of your perspective, have you seen your organization's sales cycle shortened? If so, what have those changes been?
Yeah, so I mean, we're a new business, so in a way, I don't have that history, but I think there's a number of factors at play, and it's actually interesting. A lot of your questions you could equally answer from a more general perspective, and rather than how has a pandemic helped. I think there's a general increased acknowledgement that RegTech is necessary, and regulation itself is it's not going away. It's there's more and more of it, and firms are really struggling under the weight of that. So it feels like a move towards closing that gap. So I think to go with that, from a RegTech perspective, we need to play our part. Obviously, we want to be commercially viable and successful. So the question, is how can we have a really efficient sales process? So I think it works, for our good, but also for the good of the firms that will benefit from our solutions.
Yeah, I'd agree on that. And in terms of the changes, I agree about all the answers before as well. In terms of the changes we've made, funnily enough, the big change we've made is to make the next steps in the process clearer in the purchasing, because it's been shortened. Beforehand, you had more chance to well, not more chance, but you had to go a bit slower. Now everything's going a bit faster. We've made that more efficient in saying visibility over that process. And one little bit I might throw in on why is it coming from banks is maybe because they were behind the curve. I think large banks tend to be large. And my view on RegTech adoption has been that smaller companies have been faster to adopt before, and maybe that banks have been slower to the table. And what's happened, because they've had to come to the table really quickly, they formed that big chunk in that slide you've got there with the stats. But also the second big chunk there was other businesses, non-financial. So as going back to Jay's point, I think it was both Jay and Vasile, it's really affected everybody. But I think that's where everyone's just been trying to get up to speed super quick.
And just on that, I'd like to add to Robert's point that, you're also seeing the other entrants that have been coming in from the fintechs and the fintech banks. So as he rightly said, the traditional brick and mortar banks were pretty much behind the curve, with the new fintechs having cutting edge technology and what have you. So absolutely agree with that.
Actually, to add to what have you done to speed up the sales process? What we really found in the last 18 months is we've had so much demand coming from compliance, even from small organizations, not just in financial services. But what's been interesting is that a lot of compliance officers, heads of compliance, came to us saying, I need to buy a solution, but I have never bought a solution before. So can you help me to actually sell it internally? So we've done a lot of work on implementing business cases that compliance officers can actually present internally to buy solutions, to buy technology, and to help them sell that internally. Because what we found is that, yeah, compliance has been generally behind the curve, but now every compliance department is looking for a solution.
Yep. And this is a great segue into our second key finding, which is around new business from cloud-based products is coming from banks. So typically financial institutions, like we mentioned before, have been pretty slow to embrace cloud technology in the past, but these attitudes towards cloud technology, especially with the pandemic, appear to be changing now. So what we have found is that 43% of participants in our survey reported that their clients were comfortable with cloud-based products, while another 43% said that their clients were more comfortable with cloud technology than they were in the past. And then additionally, like we mentioned before with the pandemic, these current threats have an influence on the adoption of cloud-based products. And it would appear that, of our survey, 92% said that the pandemic has positively impacted the adoption of cloud-based products, which you guys mentioned, previously in the last couple of questions. But just around, cloud adoption trends, like I'll hand this off to you, Nirvana. Why do you think financial institutions were generally slow to embrace cloud technology in the past, prior to obviously the pandemic?
Sure. Well, I'm going to show my age here, but I've been around quite a while. So I remember when, you mentioned cloud and everybody jumped out the window and said, "Oh, get it away from me." And the reason for that was that from a regulatory perspective, it wasn't embraced at the time when it was still up and coming. But what has actually happened, given the way the market has matured and changed and the way the technology has advanced throughout the years and the vast, speedy transformation that we've been seeing with the new entrants into the financial services market, specifically like the fintechs that I mentioned and the big techs, etc. There's more competition. And there's also more data. There's a lot more data that needs to be kept, not just from an organizational point of view, but also from a regulatory point of view. Regulators had more requirements, more data requirements, more reporting requirements, and they needed to be able to take in that data, digest that data, and be able to do something with it and have the capability to kind of have that in place. And something like cloud adoption was a much more cost-effective way to do that. So as the regulatory viewpoint started to evolve and change, then businesses have been a bit more forthcoming, well, more so now than had been before, in terms of adopting cloud for their technologies. It gives them more of an edge. And obviously with the pandemic right now as well, it is, it is what we need to use. It's a necessity in a way. So that's kind of my view on that briefly.
Yeah, and this kind of leads into our next question. Just again, like, why do you think these attitudes towards cloud technology within financial services specifically appear to be changing? I know we mentioned the pandemic, but is there anything specific with the pandemic that has caused, these attitudes to change?
Well, I think what we are kind of seeing is, it became a necessity. So the attitude had to change anyway, because when you're stuck at home inside your house, how are you going to communicate? So cloud adoption became a necessity. And I think that was one of the key factors in terms of how the industry realized that that's what they need to rely on. So that's, I think, one of the key changes.
Yep. Does anyone else have anything to add?
Yeah, I think one other factor, and I alluded to this before, in terms of, is it just a pandemic, or is it also a maturing of cloud technologies, adoption, and those who have pioneered, gone first, others can now benefit from. So I see firms adopting cloud either for that. Or also sort of FOMO, or everyone else seems to be doing it, so I should do it. But and I wonder if that could potentially cause a bit of a backlash later when some of because cloud isn't perfect. It's obviously got clear massive benefits over previous technologies, but equally it's not without risk, and maybe that's something else. Something that we all need to sort of be aware of and mitigate against. But certainly the trend is positive.
Yeah, I think also I agree with Sarah and what Nirvana was saying. I think from what we are saying is that we call it Amazon effect, where people got used to, with the click of the button, to the services, and with the timing, actually the services delivered much better. So those type of services almost impossible to be delivered from on-prem solutions, taking into account the speed, the quantum of data needs to be crunched, the innovation that is required. So just think about the growing evidence that the cloud is a fundamental factor to the fintech firms to innovate. That's why we've seen the growth of all these unicorns coming out of the financial services, the likes of Regulators and others, where they're just crunching and deploying natural language processing sort of techniques, machine learning. They're adding new products every week, every month. You can't cope with that unless you start actually innovating, and it has to be in the cloud. Another thing is, I think one of the points is that before, the compliance and privacy and data was considered to be, no, we can't go off-prem just because cybersecurity is adamant and the privacy is critical. It's been already long proven that the cybersecurity issue in the cloud is actually probably much better than sitting on-prem, because you probably less potential impact from the even insider threats that can happen. Another thing is reduced Capex. The fact that you have amount of data that was generating in the last 2 years is now 90% of all the data available. It means that the data is exploding. So storing the data and crunching the data becomes expensive if you want to keep it all on-prem. So you have to go either private cloud or public cloud or hybrid model, but it is the only cost-effective solution. And of course, the financial services, they are thinking about the costing. So I think all of that, with the fact that there are a lot of software and technology solutions now being built cloud native, it means that if you want to be in line with the progress, you basically have to adopt it. And this is on the agenda of majority of the financial service firm.
Yeah, that's a good point. And this leads into our last question. How has the pandemic positively impacted the adoption of cloud-based products and influenced Ragtech? Robert, you want to take this one?
Thank you. Yeah. So, I mean, I echo what everyone said. I think it's almost sort of, it's wrapped up in the same aspect where people have, it's a sort of consumerization of IT in a way almost. And the clickability, as Vasilis said, and as Jay said, I talked to a lot of IT providers, managed service providers, and the common refrain was they couldn't sell Teams before lockdown at all because it was number 100 in the list. And then as soon as lockdown came, all they were doing was Teams. And so I think that has really been a big impact. People working from home, not just the consumerization of IT, but almost the consumerization of work, and needing to maintain that level of professionalism. And then echoing Sarah's point, I think the increase in demand for cloud has made vendors up their game as well. So vendors are presenting a lot more mature face so that the financial services who are naturally risk averse can actually, in terms of taking on these technologies, can have more confidence in doing so.
Exactly. All right, let's move on to the third trend. So we obviously mentioned the pandemic a million times during this webinar, but it plays a huge role in the key findings from the survey. So obviously there's an increase in remote compliance from the pandemic, as organizations had to shift from this whole work from home model, it opened up a huge, set of risks for compliance teams. For example, as we mentioned before with Teams, employee organizations had to figure out how they were going to monitor these communication apps. So, Teams, Zoom, WhatsApp, employees were basically providing sensitive information through these chats. So how were organizations dealing with the risks associated with that? So outside of remote compliance, other trends that we found from the survey were, there was a rise in these virtual KYC checks. We mentioned before about the sales cycle of the Ragtech solutions increasing. So that is a result of this, increase in demand for these holistic Ragtech solutions to monitor these risk and compliance issues that organizations were experiencing as a result of the pandemic. And then no surprise here, with the rise in pandemic, 92% of RegTech firms said they had to adopt your remote working model, while 8% said that they are partly remote working. And I know prior to the whole Delta variant, organizations were on the flip side of it, where they were figuring out plans for how they were going to get organizations back into the office in the fall of this year. I know a lot of, at least in the US, a lot of organizations have stalled that because of this Delta variant. So now organizations are pushing back the plan again until next year. So there's more of an opportunity for these RegTech solutions now that, this work from home lifestyle isn't technically, temporary anymore. It's becoming almost a permanent issue for organizations. So around the pandemic and the trends, in addition to remote compliance, since that's an obvious one, what other trends have you guys noticed as a result of the pandemic? Nirvana, do you have any?
Sure. So absolutely, as you mentioned, definitely remote compliance is one of the key trends we're seeing, remote monitoring and the working from home. I speak to a lot of people, and that has its pros and cons too, because you have individuals who are quite happy to spend that time working from home and not commuting, etc. But there are those who have a more difficult home environment, and actually working from home is quite difficult for them. Another thing that I think the crisis has sparked is this wave of innovation that we've been seeing, and a new generation of entrepreneurs that are coming out, right? Was it Plato that kind of said, I think it was, necessity is indeed the mother of invention or innovation in my view, I think. So during the COVID-19 crisis, we've seen really huge, tremendous growth in digitization, and that means everything in all areas, from online customer services to remote working to supply chain reinvention to the use of AI and machine learning to improve operations. Healthcare has also changed. We've had telemedicine, and it's changed substantially, and biopharma is kind of coming into its own as well. So what happens is disruption creates space for entrepreneurs, and that's what's happening right now, especially in the States. I'm seeing a lot of that here in particular, but also across the global economy. And okay, I can admit I didn't quite see that coming. After all, after the financial crisis of 2008, 2009, we saw, small business formation declined, and it rose only slightly during the recession of 2001. But this time there's a huge flood of small businesses. And I think in the third quarter or something of 2020, I was reading somewhere, there was more than 1.5 million new business applications in the US alone. So that's almost double the figure for the same period that was recorded back the previous year. So a lot of those businesses are usually, single person establishments, etc. But we're seeing a lot of that. Europe has also had a similar blossoming, as it were. So I hope that makes sense. I'll stop there for other people's input.
No problem. Does anyone else have anything to add to that?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, there was obviously a splurge of these kind of discussions at the start of the pandemic, and now we're a year and a half on. And I mean, in my experience, I've seen a few things. So innovation, yeah, I agree there. Also a greater focus on global activity and awareness. So we've certainly benefited and really enjoyed that. And so the opportunities for collaboration, especially in the RegTech space, and the emerging trends in regulation and how to overcome some of the issues. And that's from a regulator's perspective as well as firms' perspective and RegTech. So I really hope that continues. I've seen a greater sense of empathy, and people, whether they're on their own as an entrepreneur or innovator, or in an organization, small or large, in any situation, they're more sort of looking out and thinking, who else is sharing this experience? Who can I talk to and empathize with and get support from, and so on. So that's really positive. And it's also a leveler. So it's great that most of us can work from home. I think, that was it, the 92% and 8%. I think, that's going to change quickly. I'm already seeing a lot more people around, which is good. And in some sense, you think people are just going to snap back, quicker than we think, and then people will forget a lot of, what happened in the space. But I think in general, the standout point is that remote working has been a real leveler for people. There's been disabled people or people who, for whatever reason, can't or feel less comfortable in face-to-face situations, really light up in a virtual situation, and that's really good. And I think something that we need to find ways of encouraging.
Just one point I'd like to add to what Sarah said, in terms of the global trends we're seeing as well. It really has brought the whole global community closer together, not just from a human perspective, but organizational business. So the world has kind of become a smaller place, and, there's this sense and feeling of we're all in it together, not just from a business perspective. And as Sarah pointed out, very empathetic, and we're seeing a lot of empathy trending as well, just all over the board. So yeah.
If I could just add on to that, I agree with that, and the picking up on an empathy point. I think the humanization or seeing employees as fellow humans rather than just as numbers. At the beginning of the pandemic, there was a lot of reports that managers were very fearful that remote employees just wouldn't produce, that they would slack off and all sorts of stuff. And actually, one of the stats that came through in the early days was that people found it very hard to turn off. And there was a lot of stress from working from home, having to prove that productivity and actually just not being able to turn off because everything was so sort of mated together. So I think that human aspect, the classic child barging in during an interview before lockdown was absurdly embarrassing, and now it's just great as a child there. And I think that's going into the other question, but I think it'll be interesting to see how that's maintained.
Yeah, I will say it's definitely made everyone kind of be on the same playing field. Whereas when people were remote, there were some people in the office, it was almost like you were competing for attention and other things like that. So the fact that everyone was, all at home, everyone understood everyone's challenges and pain points, I think it made the whole empathy kind of a big deal. Whereas before, people were more reluctant. Does anyone else have anything to add to that, or can move on to the next question?
Just quickly, we also saw a lot of memes coming out during the pandemic, Robert mentioned with the kid barging in or the cat Zoom calls and what have you. So it's also been fun in that sense, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep. Great. Well, I know we talked about working from home, but there is going to come a day, when the Delta variant, hopefully not another variant happens, where, organizations will eventually return to the office. Do you see any of these trends that have popped up from the pandemic disappearing, or do you see any new trends possibly emerging as a result of the pandemic?
I think if I may step in again here, and by all means, somebody shut me up if you like to, but I think definitely there's a sense that, we're going to go back to normal. There's this term, the new normal and, the old normal and what have you. We're in a new environment and a new situation. Now, our world is never, in my opinion, going to go back to pre-pandemic times. So there are significant changes that have taken place and will continue in that direction. There are certain things that may revert back, but not to the extent that they were in place prior to the pandemic. So I think we need to start also adapting to the idea and notion that perhaps we're not going to go back to the way it was at all, and start accepting changes. And the good thing about humans in general is that we were very good to adapt to situations very quickly. So, already as soon as this kind of happened, there was a big coming together and everybody started adapting, and Zoom calls and connecting online and doing all of those things, so it didn't stop. But really, I think there needs to be a sense of acceptance that I don't think we're ever going to go back to exactly the way it was. If anything, things will change, and the digital transformation that's now kind of accelerated so much more will bring in more new ways of dealing with things.
I think it's interesting seeing the emergence of opinions on this and announcements in terms of, you know, who's allowing all of their staff to work at home or not. And so I think that's going to be, people are going to move if they don't feel their employers are supportive or, you know, made the right decisions. And I think also the communities and networks that people have developed over this time, they will you know, continue to grow, I think. So that's a positive thing because ultimately we all need our tribes and networks. So I think, you know, that's a good trend that I hope continues.
There's actually a huge trend that we're seeing in terms of people leaving positions because they're required to go back to work. This is what I'm seeing out here in the US, rather than working remotely. And the remote work environment, they're paying slightly more, and people are willing to, you know, leave jobs for their own safety. I think that's a key, you know, motivator behind everything, but definitely seeing that a lot of people leaving their positions to work remote jobs.
And I think also the in the UK from the pandemic handling, there was an initial my take of it is there was an initial confidence in the government's handling of it. After they started handling it, they were a bit late maybe to the game, but then they felt they were doing quite well, and then that confidence disappeared a bit. And with all the sort of confusing remarks coming through, the population in the UK took matters into their own hands and made their own decision based on the facts and decided, well, you know, people were wearing masks a lot more than the mandate said, or earlier people were working from home before the full lockdown came. I think when, you know, Boris tried to get everybody to go back to the office but stay at home and all that confusing messaging, people were just like, we're not ready to go back yet. And so there's a big power of the individual and power of the collective thought. And I think that adoption of RegTech isn't going to go away, because once you've adopted a good cloud-based solution, it just makes everything easier and frees up your time for other thing. You're not going to move away from it. So I think that will enable a more open, flexible environment to allow people to be more accommodating to people. It'll be interesting to see how long that will hold.
It will be. All right, cool. So this leads us into our fourth trend, which is around the role of the regulator. But before we move on to that, we do have a quick poll question. So I'm going to launch it in just 1 second. So I stole this from our fellow panelist, Sarah. She promoted this on her LinkedIn channel, but feel free to read through the question. It's around, you know, what should regulators focus on to assist the adoption of RegTech solutions? So should they work with the industry to agree how to derive greater benefits from sandbox activities? Should they collaborate or contribute to activities to help increase awareness and understanding of RegTech? Should they work with the industry to create a better understanding of the true drivers of RegTech adoption? Or lastly, nothing. They don't need to do anything as it's not their role. So I'll give just a couple of seconds for people to respond, and then we'll close the poll. So it looks like it's right now between the three of them, it's pretty close. Okay, I'm going to close it. I'm not sure if you guys can see at the top of your screen now the results. It looks like pretty even, but I guess the third one, working with industries to create a better understanding of the true drivers of RegTech adoption, won the poll, but it just seemed everyone kind of has conflicting opinions about this question. Okay, so we're going to move on to our fourth trend, which is around, you know, vendors want regulators to take a more proactive role in the promotion of cloud-based products. So one issue that's come up a lot recently is this, you know, what is the role of regulators in the adoption of RegTech? Many vendors believe that regulators should actively promote the use of RegTech. And as you can see in our survey, 83% of participants said they are keen for regulators to take a more proactive role in this promotion of RegTech solutions, which is no surprise here. And to date, regulators have approached this issue in different ways. You can see here from the different quotes that, you know, the FCA, for example, called for RegTech firms to press their own case for the greater adoption of digital compliance solutions. By contrast, you know, the Hong Kong Monetary Authority launched a 2-year roadmap to promote RegTech adoption in the Hong Kong banking sector. So it really varies based off the industry, based on the country, you know, these conflicting issues around what is the role of regulators in terms of RegTech solutions. So I'm keen to hear from our panelists here around these issues. So what do you see the role of the regulator to be at the present time? I'll hand this off to you, Jay.
Yeah, I think at the present time, regulators are doing a lot on the innovation side, but probably not enough sometimes that I see internally. When we talk to our clients, some of the biggest issues they have today that they can't solve is the classification, the understanding, and just purely aggregation of all of the regulatory rules that apply to them across the world from different regulators, not just financial regulators, but you've got financial regulators, data privacy regulators, health and safety, environmental. So you've got hundreds, if not thousands of regulators which are applicable to you, and each one is publishing their rules in a very different way. It's great to see sandbox environments from regulators, and we have seen a lot of innovation coming from those sandbox environments. From early licenses which were issued to smaller firms to operate in not gray markets, but markets which haven't been fully regulated yet. That led to a lot of innovation. We're seeing that in cryptocurrency, just generally decentralized finance and crypto markets. But I think, what I would like to see from regulators more is actually looking internally how they publish regulations and how they digitize them, how they bring them and make them easy to understand to the firms that they regulate. We have seen that in the tech industry. All the code is digitized, structured, and published via Git repositories, GitHub, Bitbucket, and there is a whole ecosystem on how to deploy that code into any environment you want at the click of a button. Why can't we have the same thing where you've got regulations which are completely digital and which are interacting with internal systems?
Yep. And I want to pose this next question to you, Sarah, possibly you, Robert. What actions or initiatives would you like to see taken from regulators? Oh, Sarah, I think you're on mute.
Okay, so I was going to say you first, Robert.
Okay. So thank you. So I think it's a very difficult position for a regulator, and I think, as Jay says, there are lots of different regulators, and it could be a call actually for a different type of body, because typically a regulator comes into a market when there's something that's not really performing as society wishes it to do so, and otherwise you try and sort of reduce the level of red tape. So I think maybe there's a different body that should come into being for this. But one of the things I liked, for example, in New Zealand, in the privacy arena, during lockdown, they actually did have the rule that shops and restaurants, etc., had to actually take certain data. Here, it was always actually typically, unfortunately, through the period, very uncertain. The actual situation was very few people had to. The government said they would like them to, but a lot of pubs and what have you thought they should do. And they were doing it in a very bad way in terms of personal data and privacy by design. In New Zealand, the privacy commissioner there, who's actually the preferred candidate to take over here at the ICO, which is fantastic. What they did there was they produced a privacy-friendly badge, and they said, right, for the pandemic, there's this particular thing that businesses need to do. There's a lot of uncertainty. We're going to make this badge available. We will create a 10-point plan that we check people against, and we'll give the solutions a privacy-friendly badge so that organizations can see, okay, these, and there were some very non-technical solutions through to very technical solutions. And so I think there's a very good way that different regulators can take steps to not prioritize one particular vendor, but to enable that maturity on both sides of the vendors and of the de-risking and building confidence from the purchasing side.
Yeah, I support that, Robert, and it's interesting you mentioned space for a new type of body, which is something that, we've been talking and thinking about. So, and this question, the role of the regulator as well. I think in terms of Ragtech and Ragtech adoption, it sort of implies, maybe deliberately or not, that it's up to the regulators to support Ragtechs. And my view is they have a role, but it's, you know, not just them, it's very much each type of party in the ecosystem. So firms themselves, vendors, regulators, lawyers, you know, there's many sides, you know, on the table. In terms of initiatives, so I think, you know, it's quite out for collaboration. You know, there needs to be a better understanding, and you know, the regulators have been very active in terms of innovation and supporting that. But my sense is the question is being asked, what's next? You know, sort of moving into a next stage of maturity, if you like. So, you know, looking forward to seeing what's, you know, coming through there, and equally it is up to industry to be active in that space as well. I think the other thought here is in terms of how, you know, has present day situation inspired momentum for RegTech. So, you know, so much has happened in the last 5 to 10 years. I mean, the amount of regulation itself, and then in response to that, the volume of technology and solutions, and that's good. But if you look at it from the regulator's perspective, you know, how could they have adapted in response to that and keep up with their, you know, primary role? You know, you can't just sort of develop capabilities and expertise and systems and all sorts, you know, overnight, and they're battling with, you know, the questions around you know, crypto and blockchain and so on, and the financial ecosystem has changed as well. So we've moved from, you know, just being incumbents to, you know, a lot of fintechs. So there's a huge amount of change there. So the role of the regulator, you know, without supporting RegTech isn't enough in itself. So it's an interesting space.
I'd like to add to that, if that's okay. You know, echoing what Robert and Sarah both rightly said, I think, you know, the role of the regulator, we've got it when we look at RegTech, we have to remember that it's not just financial services. It hits across any sector with regulation. So the regulators that should be involved are across multiple industries. Therefore, what Sarah said about having an independent body that kind of sits in the middle, I think is a great idea. And we need to start looking into that with key industry stakeholders running that. I've worked a lot with regulators throughout the years, certainly in the RegTech sense, where I've actually told them, you know, we need to take you to our offices, show you the technology so you can get your heads around the technology, and therefore your policies and the way you write them will be more informed. There has to be an understanding of all of that. So having a financial services regulator regulating a healthcare RegTech product isn't going to work. The parameters are going to be different. The insights need to be different. So we need to take that into consideration. That's why I really am quite vocal about this in terms of you know, advocating to have an independent body. Especially, we have huge new entrants as well from the big techs that you know, there needs to be regulation there, but who's going to regulate them? And you know, it's not up to the financial services regulators to regulate a tech vendor, for example. You know, it needs to have an independent body that has a grasp of the understanding, not just regulatory perspective, but from a business operational perspective across the board. So anyway, that's my 2 cents on that. I'm very vocal about that. I'm passionate about that. It's important who regulates.
Yeah, that's why it's great to have you on the panel, Ivana, because I just did that default thing and slipped into just talking about financial services. But yeah, I think
no, not at all.
To do.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And, you know, RegTech has been, in a way, kind of been adopted by financial services. So that's why we're kind of hearing more about it. But there's other sectors as well. That's why I'm kind of seeing a danger in us going down that route. And if you like crypto, for example, and the way the regulations are coming out in regards to that, it's a different product and instrument. But the view is, you know, well, we'll just treat it as another instrument. Well, we need to look at it slightly differently because it's a different thing, you know. So it's about changing legacy thinking, legacy way of doing things, and really looking at a more innovative approach, more holistic and all-encompassing approach with a view to having compliance by design at the onset to mitigate risk, but also having that open-mindedness to see what else is possible. If anything, the pandemic has kind of made us become more open-minded in terms of that.
Yeah,
I'll get off my soapbox now.
In terms of present day situations, so ESG, you can't look anywhere without hearing about that. And from an investment perspective, I mean, I'm hearing a lot of capital is moving away from the more sort of traditional early types of RegTech towards ESG. So that's it. I don't know if you agree with that or what your view is.
Yeah, I think what we are saying is ESG become almost like a paramount in almost in every portfolio we're looking. We actually introduced, we hired ESG officer Thales. So we're now supporting every portfolio company that wants to introduce their policies. Part of the term sheet, we're introducing that they need to be ESG compliant, and I think that becomes almost mandatory. So I think that's a big shift, and I think this would be also partially driven what we will see in the regulation and compliance. Coming just a few comments on some of the questions in terms of where we see the initiatives done by the regulators and what's happening. I think we've seen a few, and we've had lots of interesting comments from our panelists, and I totally agree with you. I think just to maybe emphasize a few that we come across and we see. So as we mentioned, I think now we see almost anything or everything becoming a computer. So we have smart toys, smart sort of cars, smart cities, smart grids. All of that means that everything will be connected. And from that perspective, I think before the regulator was focusing on the consumer protection, but now the whole paradigm shift is going to that data protection. So the whole model of safeguarding the client, but making sure that their money or sort of assets not get lost and misappropriated. Now, the commodity being the data, then we'll see the whole shift in terms of how the financial decisions on monetizations and the security and privacy of the data will become paramount. So there will be lots of regulation on that side. Before, we've seen lots of capital regulation. Companies have capital control requirements in place. But now, going forward, what we'll see, and I think it has already been put in place in some geographies, is that algorithm compliance. So this would be involved in terms of the process automation. So regulators will be doing due diligence on the automated system before it's allowed to operate in the market, as Jay was referring to. Again, what we've seen is that most of the regulation and compliance was driven towards preventing bad behavior. And I think what we're seeing, and I think where the regulators can set the system in place is actually where good behavior is reinforced and rewarded, and sort of strengthening the quality of the financial networks. So again, going from the reactive side to proactive, I think all of those things is actually allowing to the fact that we're connected, and the data becomes the core ingredient out of that. So again, moving from reporting compliance to, let's say, API compliance is another big shift. So a better way in the future would be to the process of the API compliance where the regulator just can pull information directly and analyze and make their decision. So all of that is just creating a huge shift. And we're already seeing, I think Nirvana was mentioning regulatory earthquakes taking place, with lots of regulation taking place. And it will only get bigger and more complex. Hence sort of the need of all the solutions that we see now coming to the market.
Yep. All right. So I know we're running a little bit over, so we're going to go to the final trend, which is around there is an increase in malicious activity witnessed by Ragtech firms. So according to our study, 27% of participants reported their financial firms using their technology had detected 9.1 more instances of nefarious activity over the period compared to the same time last year. And this is no surprise, as I know regulators have warned financial institutions to be particularly watchful in relation to their IT networks, and also just to be aware of, new money laundering risks. And then also just a quick thing that we found from our survey is that 54% of respondents said they have the same level of confidence, whereas 31% said that they were less confident about the health of these industries. And this is probably a result of those risks associated with the pandemic. So panelists, final questions for you around the health of financial organizations specifically. This is a question for you, Robert. How do you think organizations can improve the culture for incident reporting? Oh, Robert, I think you're on mute.
The biggest phrase in 2021. Sorry, so yes, I totally agree with that. And qualitatively, I've heard from multiple vendors who look at incident response that they already dealt with more in the first half of this year than did the whole of last year. So I think the cultural change actually, I think, is very much helped by cloud adoption. Things like cloud systems for policy management of any area, of training, of awareness, of recording, of being able to get insights and good reporting anytime, anywhere. All of that collaboration that cloud-based tech enables much more than any other is going to help drive the culture. But I think that there's a real transparency and visibility issue as well, because there was a study that showed that the confidence in the compliance levels by the senior management, the very senior management, sort of board level C-suite, was not reflected in the confidence of the compliance by the people doing the job a couple of levels down. And there was a recent KPMG study that asked 250 director level people in 1,000+ employee companies in the US just this year. And they said actually 29% said their company sometimes employed unethical data collection methods, and 33% said consumers should be concerned how their personal data is being used. So this was across organizations, but I think it does show that there's a long way to go on culture and awareness. But I do think that this is being driven from the ground up very happily, like we talked about before, about people taking things off their own bat and knowing that they're working at home or working remotely from a cafe or what have you. They've got to be very careful about security and compliance. And I think that this mismatch between what the potentially from the top down look is and the bottom up look is, I think there's a good groundswell of awareness now coming from the bottom up, and it will drive more adoption of the cloud-based services to help with that. So I think it's all coming together quite nicely. I'm very positive on it.
And now I was on mute. Great. So moving on to our second question around how do we make sure conduct is followed? I don't know, Jay, if you want to answer that, or anyone else.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is quite an important part in compliance, and it has become a lot more important in the last few years. We have seen an influx of AML KYC solutions, then trade reporting, transaction monitoring solutions. Suddenly, regulators are looking into conduct and how do we make sure that we're not trying to prevent bad behavior, which is what was said before, but actually we encourage good behavior. And how do you actually communicate what people are expected to do, which is compliant with regulations? In fact, it's very, very difficult, purely because a lot of organizations don't have the full understanding of all of the obligations which are applicable to them, and then also don't have a way to communicate those obligations to employees in a central way. And we have seen huge wave of adoption just of the technology of communicating policies and procedures to employees, mapping those policies and procedures to the regulatory obligations. So you can actually have that traceability. Okay, here's our obligation, here is how we're implementing it within the organization, here is how we communicate it, and then we track engagement with that content. And we have seen, for example, last year, Department of Justice in the US issued the guidance on compliance systems, which talks about the having the ability of, or actually mandating organizations to monitor engagement with compliance content, to make that compliance content dynamic. So it's not a compliance manual sitting on the shelf and it's just, dust is brushed off it. every time there is a regulatory question from a regulator. So I think, conduct is more about being able to dynamically communicate what is expected, and then having the ability to track that engagement and understand how the culture of conduct is evolving within the organization.
Great. And as we wrap up this webinar, does anyone have any closing thoughts, or where do we go from here?
Yeah, I like that point, Jay, that you made. I mean, obviously you need exactly the right solutions to help knit the pieces together in terms of what the regulator says you need to do, and then how you make that happen through policies, controls, and so on. I think what the gap is, and not just in your solution or Robert's or any RegTech solution, is that marriage of technology with humans. Ultimately, is in cyber, people say, computers don't commit crime, it's people. So with conduct, it's people. So you really need that strong cultural narrative and demonstration in an organization. But then if you've got the tool to help make clear what needs to be done, and then tracking and evidencing the gap being closed, then that's a perfect marriage. So I think in terms of where we go from here, that's one key theme that we see to speed up adoption of RegTech.
Mm-hmm.
Just to add something further to Sarah's point, she's absolutely right. It is the humans that commit the crimes at the end of the day. So when we're looking at RegTech type solutions, it's not the be all and end all. But what it is, you should look at it as your productivity superpower in a way, right? It's going to make you be more efficient, more cost effective, and be able to implement those rules and regulations and what have you that's needed. We're also, from a regulatory perspective, are seeing the regulators stepping up and giving mandates. And the FCA and the PRA have recently mandated, I think it goes into effect March 2022 next year, in terms of operational resilience, which really, I think, kind of helps organizations to put the right conduct and culture in place in terms of how they carry on forward. But it's not just tick box activity, right? It has to come from the top down and really demonstrated throughout the organization, I think, with the kind of understanding that, we want to be compliant by design going forward. So yeah, that's my 2 pence worth, or 2 cents worth, as I'm based in the States now.
No, I agree with Nirvana and Sarah. And actually, I'm going to hijack a bit of what Vasily said in the pre-call that we had to this when we were talking about this question. So I don't want to throw him under the bus, but I think his summary was very good at that point. But we all talked about just, there's no option. Like all the regulations are there, you've got to comply with them. The volume of data is doubling every 2 years, what have you. There's more people watched. There were more hours watched on Netflix this year than there were since the Bronze Age, or something ridiculous as a stat. There's just the sheer volume of data, the volume of connectedness, and also the, as we said, the bad actors and the ability for those bad actors to come in various different innovative ways. There's just no way for people not to look to increase security, increase that human aspect, and the focus on the benefits and the risk to the individuals, and as well as the businesses. So that's my tuppence.
Well, that sums it up nicely. If no one has anything else, we're gonna wrap up this webinar. So it doesn't look like we have time for questions, but I'll take a look at them and we'll respond to each of you individually. And before I shout out everyone, I do just want to say thank you to each and every one of our panelists today. Thank you for your valuable insight and feedback. I think this was a great panel and we really appreciate your time with this. So with that, I just wanted to remind everyone, we do have a Voice of RegTech report. If you haven't taken a look at that, you can go to clausematch.com and download that report. We'll also include a link of that report in tomorrow's follow-up email, along with a link to the slides and recording. So with that, I want to thank you guys again, all of our panelists, as well as all of our attendees for joining today. We hope each of you have a great day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye.